For almost 3 decades, a wall cut through a city as if history itself had chosen a line and then poured concrete into it. It ran across streets, past apartment buildings, over canals, beside graveyards, behind factories, and through the memory of families who woke one morning to discover that a journey they had taken all their lives had become impossible. Children grew up staring at the same skyline from opposite political universes. Grandparents died with addresses still written in old notebooks that could no longer be reached. Lovers learned to speak through distance that was measured not in miles, but in systems. By the end of the 20th century, the Berlin Wall had become so familiar that people outside Germany often treated it as scenery for the Cold War, a fixed symbol that had always been there and might remain there forever. But on the night of November 9, 1989, the barrier that had defined Europe's most dangerous fault line ceased to function in the way it had been designed. It did not vanish in a single cinematic instant. There was no one command, no single blast, no marching army that pushed it down. Instead, the wall lost authority in public before it lost mass in concrete. It stopped being obeyed before it stopped standing. Crowds moved toward checkpoints that had long enforced separation. Border guards, uncertain of their instructions and unwilling to become the agents of catastrophe, allowed people to pass. A system built on predictability entered the realm of improvisation. The line that had divided Berlin, Germany, Europe, and in some symbolic sense the post-war world, was suddenly no longer final. To understand why that night mattered, it is not enough to narrate the images everyone remembers. Young Berliners standing on top of the wall, champagne passing hand to hand, hammers striking concrete, strangers weeping in one another's arms. Those images matter because they captured something real, but they arrived at the end of a long process. The wall had a biography before it had an ending. It emerged from occupation, fear, ideology, humiliation, migration, bureaucratic planning, and the unresolved wreckage of the Second World War. It shaped daily life through paperwork, steel barriers, mined ground, watchtowers, searchlights, permits, informants, and rules so minute that they entered the body as habit. It turned one city into the physical stage on which the Cold War learned to see itself. It was a military boundary, a propaganda object, a prison, a guarantee, a wound, and for many who lived under its shadow, a fact of weather. When it finally opened, what collapsed was not only a border regime. A whole way of imagining permanence cracked with it. The story of the Berlin Wall is therefore not just the story of the night it opened. It is the story of how a victorious alliance became an occupation, how an occupation hardened into a geopolitical contest, how a contest was translated into concrete, how millions learned to live inside that translation, and how, after nearly 30 years, the thing that had once looked immovable revealed itself to be contingent after all. Berlin was already a difficult city before it became a divided one. The capital of a defeated Reich, it entered the post-war era not as an intact metropolis ready to resume ordinary life, but as a field of ruins, hunger, displaced persons, black markets, administrative improvisation, and moral exhaustion. Allied bombers and Soviet artillery had not merely damaged buildings. They had shattered the physical and political center of a state that had tried to dominate Europe and in doing so had pulled the continent into catastrophe. The Allied powers that occupied Germany after the war agreed on one basic point. Nazism had to be destroyed and Germany had to be prevented from becoming the engine of another continental war. Yet beyond that, agreement frayed quickly. The United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, and France each possessed occupation zones. Berlin, though deep inside the Soviet zone, was itself divided into sectors. This arrangement reflected wartime cooperation at the very moment when that cooperation was decaying. In the first years after 1945, policy toward Germany remained unsettled. Should the country be kept weak and agrarian, punished to the point of incapacity? Should it be rebuilt economically but controlled politically? How should reparations be collected? How would denazification be enforced? Who would govern locally in a society where legitimacy had been burned away by dictatorship and defeat? These questions were never purely administrative. They carried within them different visions of Europe's future. In the Soviet zone, occupation authorities and German communists moved to reorder political life under centralized control. In the Western zones, Economic reconstruction and political pluralism began to take shape under different assumptions. The fracture did not open overnight, but the pressures were there from the start. Berlin became the place where those pressures were most visible because it was both symbol and anomaly. The former capital of Nazi Germany, the site of Soviet victory, and an island of Western presence embedded inside Soviet-controlled territory. The city's daily life in the late 1940s was therefore saturated with uncertainty. People scavenged for food and fuel while also learning to navigate new ideological grammars. They traded cigarettes, coal, gossip, and political instinct. Women cleared rubble with bare hands and improvised tools. Officials from different powers tried to govern neighboring districts according to increasingly incompatible models. Germans themselves, whether communists, social democrats, conservatives, apolitical survivors, or opportunists, adapted as best they could to a world in which occupation was both the condition of life and the framework through which the future would be decided. The eventual division of Germany into two states was not written into the city at the end of the war, but the ingredients were already present. Berlin's later story cannot be understood unless we begin from that unstable post-war landscape in which defeat had erased the old order without producing a common replacement. The wall, when it came, was not the beginning of division. It was the concrete expression of a division that had already worked its way through policy, economics, policing, and imagination. The first great crisis that taught Berliners and the wider world what their city had become came before the wall existed. In 1948, as the Western powers moved toward currency reform and the institutional consolidation of their zones, Stalin chose confrontation. The Soviet blockade of West Berlin attempted to force the Western Allies out of the city by severing land and water access. If Berlin could be strangled logistically, perhaps the anomaly of Western sectors inside the Soviet zone would disappear, and with it one of the most potent irritants of the emerging Cold War. For the people of West Berlin, the blockade transformed geopolitics into calories, electricity, and winter survival. Coal, flour, medicine, machinery, and every ordinary necessity became political objects. The Western response, the Berlin airlift, turned the sky into a lifeline. Aircraft arrived around the clock, one after another, carrying what a city required to live. In strategic terms, the airlift was an astonishing demonstration of logistical discipline. In psychological terms, it rewired the meaning of Berlin. West Berlin was no longer merely an occupied district of a defeated capital. It became a forward symbol of Western commitment. The Soviet attempt to force withdrawal had instead dramatized the city's importance. The blockade failed, but the lesson it taught was profound. Berlin would not be stabilized by trust. It would be stabilized, if at all, by systems designed against the possibility of trust. The blockade and airlift also hardened local identities. In East Berlin and the Soviet zone, communist institutions deepened their hold. In the Western sectors, political allegiance to the Western Alliance acquired emotional force because it had been tested under pressure. When the Federal Republic of Germany and the German Democratic Republic were formally established in 1949, Germany's division passed from provisional condition toward durable statehood. Yet Berlin remained incomplete. West Berlin belonged politically and economically to the Western system, but sat geographically inside the GDR. East Berlin served as the capital of the socialist state, though its international status remained awkward. Families crossed sectors. Trains and streets still connected lives that the emerging superpower order increasingly wished to separate. The city was divided in law and administration before it was sealed in concrete. That difference mattered. It meant that for more than a decade after the war, Berliners experienced the Cold War not as total closure, but as a tense coexistence of permeability and pressure. People could still move, and precisely because they could move, Berlin became a crisis for the East German state. Every crossing was a choice, and every choice exposed the weakness of a regime trying to claim legitimacy while hemorrhaging citizens to the other side. The East German uprising of June 1953 revealed how fragile the socialist state could look even before mass flight became its most visible problem. What began with construction workers protesting increased work quotas in East Berlin quickly widened into broader demonstrations against the regime. The grievances were economic, political, and emotional all at once. Workers who were supposed to embody the legitimacy of the socialist order were now publicly defying it. Crowds gathered. Slogans escalated. The regime, lacking confidence in its own ability to contain the unrest, called in Soviet tanks. The uprising was crushed, but the memory remained. It taught East German leaders that dissent could move fast when it entered the street, and it taught ordinary people that the state's ultimate language was force. Throughout the 1950s, the German Democratic Republic faced a crisis that was quieter than an uprising, but in the long run, even more dangerous: immigration. The problem was not simply that people disliked the regime. It was that Berlin provided an exit. Skilled professionals, workers, students, intellectuals, technicians, and young people unwilling to imagine their future under socialist restriction could travel to Berlin and then continue west. This was especially damaging because it combined economic loss with political humiliation. A state that claimed to represent the future was watching part of its population vote against it with their feet. The numbers were staggering. By the late 50s and into 1961, the flow became intolerable from the perspective of East German leadership. Every departure reinforced the sense that the border, as then constituted, was not a boundary, but a leak. West Berlin functioned not only as a geopolitical irritant, but as a shop window, labor market, cultural magnet, and escape hatch. East German citizens could compare systems in immediate rather than abstract terms. They could see consumer goods, hear different broadcasts, talk to relatives, and imagine departure as a practical possibility rather than a distant fantasy. That was precisely what made Berlin so destabilizing. Ideology prefers distance because distance allows explanation. Berlin destroyed distance. It placed competing systems face to face and let people move between them. For Walter Ulbricht and the East German leadership, this was not a tolerable arrangement. Yet sealing the city carried enormous political risk. Openly admitting the need to imprison one's own population is an awkward form of statecraft. So official language stressed defense, anti-fascism, and protection against Western aggression. But beneath the rhetoric stood a simpler reality. The regime needed to stop its people from leaving. The crisis of legitimacy that the wall would embody was already clear before a single roll of barbed wire appeared. The state had not solved its contradiction. It had decided to build around it. On the night of August 13, 1961, East German authorities moved. Streets were cut, rail lines interrupted, and coils of barbed wire unrolled through the sleeping city. People awoke to find soldiers, police, construction workers, and barricades where, the day before, there had been ordinary urban continuity. A crossing that had once required little more than a decision now required permission or became impossible. At first, much of what would later be remembered as the Berlin Wall looked improvised. Wire, temporary barriers, rough obstacles, armed men. But improvisation does not make such acts less historic. Often it makes them more shocking. Berliners could see the logic immediately even if the state wrapped it in anti-fascist language. This was not the defensive shield of official propaganda. It was a closure imposed on a city because too many people had been leaving. The physical violence of the separation was visible from the start. Buildings along the sector border suddenly became border architecture. Windows were sealed. Doorways were blocked. Streets ended against walls. In some places, families literally found themselves divided overnight. Workers who had crossed sectors for employment could no longer do so. Commuters, students, patients, lovers, and the merely curious discovered that routines built over years had been erased by dawn. The Western Allies protested but did not intervene militarily. That decision, however rational in Cold War terms, underscored a brutal truth for Berliners. The city's fate would be managed within limits set by superpower caution. No one was going to start World War III over open streets. East German authorities quickly moved from barbed wire to more durable structures. Over time, the border was transformed into a system: walls, fencing, anti-vehicle trenches, floodlights, dog runs, signal devices, patrol roads, observation towers, and the dreaded death strip between inner and outer barriers. The wall that later entered global memory as a single object was in practice a layered border regime with zones, procedures, technologies, and trained personnel. It was designed not merely to separate but to detect, delay, expose, and, if necessary, kill. Escape attempts therefore became not just acts of desperation or courage, but tests of an entire security architecture. The wall's construction also redefined West Berlin. If before it had been a vulnerable enclave, now it became a highly dramatized island. The city's status as a Western outpost deep inside East Germany acquired fresh theatrical force. Western politicians could now point literally to the barrier and say, "Here is the line between systems." But for those who lived with it, the wall was less metaphor than rhythm. It altered time as much as space. It taught people what routes to stop imagining, which absences to absorb, which hopes to suppress, and which forms of grief could no longer expect resolution. Living in East Berlin and the broader GDR after the wall went up meant inhabiting a world in which the ordinary had been reorganized around control. This does not mean that daily life was nothing but terror. That misconception flattens history and erases the complexity of how authoritarian states reproduce themselves. People worked, married, studied, joked, raised children, pursued hobbies, and sought pleasure. Apartments were furnished, holidays observed, meals cooked, arguments had. But all of this unfolded within a system that treated mobility, information, association, and speech as matters of political management. The state promised security, employment, social provision, and an anti-fascist moral identity. In return, it demanded compliance and attempted to saturate society with institutions capable of monitoring deviation. The Ministry for State Security, the Stasi, became the most notorious expression of that effort, but it did not act alone. Schools, workplaces, party structures, housing committees, and informal networks all helped produce an environment in which uncertainty about who might report whom entered everyday behavior. Fear was rarely theatrical. More often it operated as calculation. What can be said here? To whom? In what tone? About whom? Such questions train the self. The wall intensified that training because it made visible what the system was protecting itself against. Every denied travel request, every carefully worded complaint, every official slogan about peace and socialism unfolded under the silent fact that a barrier existed because the state did not trust its own citizens with free exit. Some accommodated sincerely. Some believed in socialism or in the anti-fascist mission of the GDR. Some found opportunities within the system. Some withdrew into private life. Some became dissidents. Many learned to do several things at once. Outward conformity, inner skepticism, practical compromise. That complexity mattered. States do not survive by pure coercion. They survive by distributing incentives, routines, and exhausted realism. The wall also shaped generational consciousness. Children born after 1961 did not remember an open city. For them, the division was less an event than an environment. Yet environments still leave marks. They defined maps, family stories, television habits, travel fantasies, and the very sense of what counted as normal political possibility. Even for those who accepted the state's framework, the wall made the promise of socialist legitimacy awkward. A society confident in its superiority should not need to cage its population. Everyone understood that contradiction even when no one said it plainly. And because the contradiction was built into concrete, it could not be argued away. It could only be normalized, aestheticized, moralized, or feared. The wall thus produced a distinctive kind of truth, one that everyone could see and many had to pretend not to interpret too openly. West Berlin lived under a different pressure, shielded by Western guarantees yet cut off from the surrounding East German landscape. It became one of the strangest cities in post-war Europe, a capitalist enclave, a frontline symbol, a cultural laboratory, and for many in the Federal Republic, a site of political projection. West Berliners enjoyed freedoms their Eastern counterparts did not, but those freedoms existed under the constant reminder that they were geographically isolated. The city's air corridors, transit arrangements, and political status made daily normality dependent on larger strategic commitments. This produced a civic psychology that mixed defiance, performative vitality, and unease. West Berlin was supported economically and symbolically by the Federal Republic and its allies. Subsidies, cultural institutions, universities, and a certain frontier glamour all marked the city. For some artists, students, and intellectuals, West Berlin's peculiar status made it attractive precisely because it sat at the edge of systems. Yet the wall never allowed Western exuberance to forget its darker mirror. One could ride through the city and encounter at any moment the concrete proof that Europe's ideological conflict was not an abstraction. Observation platforms were built so that Western visitors could look across into the East. Tourists came. Statesmen came. Cameras lingered. The wall became a global object partly because West Berlin gave the world a stage from which to view it. This symbolic importance culminated in political speeches that entered Cold War mythology. When John F. Kennedy declared himself a Berliner in 1963, he was doing more than offering solidarity. He was affirming the city as an emblem of Western endurance. When Ronald Reagan in 1987 called on Mikhail Gorbachev to tear down the wall, the line worked precisely because the barrier had become shorthand for the whole conflict. Yet life in West Berlin was not simply theater for global audiences. People there had relatives in the East, memories of pre-wall continuity, and daily encounters with a border regime that could turn tragic without warning. Escapees arrived in the West with stories that reminded the city of the cost of division. Gunfire at the border, funerals, courtroom reports, and the names of those killed trying to cross all entered public memory. West Berlin thus became at once protected and haunted. Its freedoms were real, but they were refracted through proximity to unfreedom. This duality gave the city its special intensity. It was Western yet enclosed, lively yet edged by grief, cosmopolitan yet trapped within the geometry of the Cold War. The wall made West Berlin exceptional, but exception is not comfort. It is a condition of being watched by history more than most cities ever are. The wall did not go unchallenged. From the first days after August 1961, Berliners began testing the system built to stop them. Some escaped in the chaos before barriers were fully hardened. Others leapt from windows in border-adjacent buildings before those windows were bricked up. Tunnels were dug. Cars were modified. False compartments were constructed. Forged documents were carried. Hot air balloons, improvised aircraft, stolen vehicles, ropes, and extraordinary nerve all entered the history of flight from east to west. Every successful escape exposed a weakness. Every failed one reminded the city of the state's willingness to kill. The border guards who enforced the regime were trained under orders that placed lethal force within the normal vocabulary of control. Those killed at the wall did not all die in dramatic spectacles. Some bled in view of Western witnesses. Some drowned. Some were shot in the death strip while onlookers watched helplessly from platforms or nearby streets. Their stories punctured the routine of division and reminded Berliners that the wall was not metaphor, but mechanism. Escape itself took on a peculiar moral status. In a normal city, movement is unremarkable. In Berlin, movement became testimony. To flee was to indict. To prevent flight was to confess what kind of regime one represented. The state tried to portray escapees as criminals, traitors, dupes, or victims of Western manipulation. Yet each tunnel, each forged passport, each family plan conducted in whispers revealed that the desire to leave could not be administered away. At the same time, not everyone tried to escape. That too is important. The wall's history is not only one of heroic defiance, but of adaptation, exhaustion, family obligation, fear, and the compromises by which most people survive authoritarian systems. To stay could mean conviction, caution, resignation, entanglement, or all four at once. The state exploited that complexity. It knew that if everyone became either dissident or fugitive, it would fail quickly. But if most people could be kept in a gray zone between dissatisfaction and resignation, the system could endure. So the wall became part of a larger equilibrium of control and accommodation. Escapes dramatized the regime's violence, but everyday compliance allowed it to continue. Both truths must be held together. Otherwise, the history becomes melodrama rather than politics. What made the wall so effective was not only the danger of crossing, but the way it entered imagination as a limit. It taught millions to police their own horizon before they ever approached the concrete itself. That is one reason its collapse later felt so shocking. A structure that had occupied the mind as much as the city was suddenly revealed to be mortal. In the 1960s and 70s, the Cold War moved through phases of confrontation and relaxation, and Berlin moved with it, though never completely. Crises such as the Cuban Missile Crisis altered the temperature of global politics, but the wall remained. It was at once a resolved frontier and an unresolved wound. Diplomacy gradually learned to manage the division of Germany without solving it. Ostpolitik, the policy associated above all with West German Chancellor Willy Brandt, attempted something both pragmatic and morally risky: to improve relations with the East, not by denying division, but by acknowledging reality and working through it. This meant treaties, recognition, transit agreements, and the slow creation of channels through which divided Germans could maintain limited contact. Critics feared normalization would legitimize partition. Supporters argued that refusing reality helped no one trapped inside it. In practice, Ostpolitik did not remove the wall, but it changed the terms in which it was lived. Visits became somewhat easier under certain conditions. Contact between the two German states acquired more administrative shape. The Federal Republic pursued a long strategy of engagement without surrendering its claim to national unity. Meanwhile, the GDR sought international recognition and a stronger image as a sovereign socialist state rather than merely a Soviet satellite. The wall therefore entered a mature phase in which its brutality remained, but its existence was absorbed into a larger architecture of managed division. This had paradoxical effects. On the one hand, the routine of the border deepened the sense that it might last forever. A generation was now aging under conditions that younger people had never known otherwise. On the other hand, the very normalization of division kept alive a nagging historical discomfort. Berlin was an open injury made bureaucratic. Transit documents, visitation permits, and diplomatic formulas could soften some practical consequences, but they could not make the line feel natural. Brandt's own kneeling at the Warsaw Ghetto Memorial in 1970 became one of the moral gestures of post-war Europe because it suggested that politics could acknowledge historical burden rather than hide behind procedure. The Berlin Wall, by contrast, always embodied the opposite impulse: to freeze history into a regime of control and insist that such freezing was peace. Yet peace built on a mobilized contradiction is unstable over the long term. It may endure for years or decades, but it accumulates moral and political costs. By the time Europe entered the late 1970s and early 80s, the border around West Berlin still looked secure, but the larger world sustaining it was beginning to change in ways the concrete could not anticipate. The Soviet bloc in the 1980s did not collapse because one speech was given or one leader emerged. It eroded through a combination of economic stagnation, technological lag, bureaucratic sclerosis, moral fatigue, and the growing inability of ruling elites to command belief with the confidence they had once claimed. The language of socialism remained official, but the distance between official language and lived reality widened. Shortages, environmental damage, debt, censorship, and the humiliations of everyday bureaucracy wore at the legitimacy of states that had long relied on a mixture of provision and coercion. In East Germany, the regime under Erich Honecker projected rigidity. The GDR presented itself as disciplined, orderly, economically competent by Eastern Bloc standards, and ideologically reliable. In some respects, it was indeed one of the more stable socialist states. But stability can conceal brittleness. The system depended heavily on surveillance, on the appearance of Soviet backing, and on the assumption that its citizens had no practical alternative. As long as neighboring socialist states behaved similarly and Moscow guaranteed the geopolitical framework, that assumption could hold. But when Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in the Soviet Union and began speaking of reform, transparency, and restructuring, the meaning of rigidity changed. Eastern Bloc populations now watched a superpower admit, however cautiously, that the old methods were failing. For regimes like East Germany's, this was dangerous. They could neither fully embrace reform without destabilizing themselves, nor wholly ignore the new atmosphere without appearing anachronistic. Meanwhile, civil society pressures accumulated. Churches provided spaces for discussion and oppositional gathering. Peace groups, environmental activists, and dissidents carved out moral niches within a system that could not easily crush every small conversation without revealing its insecurity. None of this yet guaranteed collapse. States can endure deep malaise, but the relationship between fear and belief was shifting. More people could imagine that the regime might not be eternal. Once that thought takes root, behavior begins to change. And behavior, multiplied across thousands or millions, is what finally tests power. The wall still stood, but the world in which it had been built, the world of high Stalinism, immediate post-war consolidation, and uncontested Soviet readiness to crush deviation, was no longer the world of the late 1980s. Structures built in one geopolitical climate often become clumsy in another. The East German leadership tried to project continuity. History was already moving faster than continuity could manage. The immediate prehistory of the wall's opening cannot be separated from the wider East European cascade of 1989. Poland's crisis deepened the erosion of communist monopoly through negotiations with solidarity and semi-free elections. Hungary moved toward reform and then began loosening border controls with Austria. These changes did not simply inspire East Germans in the abstract. They created routes. If one socialist state opened enough of a door, people in another could try to pass through it. During the summer of 1989, thousands of East Germans sought escape not directly through Berlin's wall, but through openings elsewhere in the bloc, especially via Hungary and through West German embassies in Prague and other capitals. Televised images of East Germans crowding embassy grounds and special trains carrying refugees westward carried symbolic force inside the GDR. They revealed both desperation and possibility. The regime could still punish, monitor, and lecture. It could no longer plausibly claim that movement was under full control. At the same time, protests inside East Germany grew. Leipzig became especially important through the Monday demonstrations associated with church-centered opposition and public dissent. Here the regime faced a different problem than simple immigration. It was one thing to lose citizens at the margins. It was another to confront organized public pressure in the streets of one's own cities. The slogan, "We are the people," condensed the challenge. Legitimacy was being claimed from below against a state that claimed to embody the people in official doctrine. The regime could have chosen massive violence. Many feared it would. Yet by autumn 1989, the conditions that had made a Soviet-style crackdown seem likely in earlier decades had shifted. The Soviet Union signaled less appetite for armed intervention. East German authorities hesitated. Protesters kept coming. Each Monday that passed without massacre strengthened the public sense that fear had limits. This did not mean courage erased danger. It meant danger no longer guaranteed obedience. As Honecker fell and Egon Krenz attempted controlled adjustment, the leadership sought to recover initiative through reform from above. But reform under pressure is treacherous. If too little is offered, the public sees weakness without satisfaction. If too much is offered too quickly, the structures of control may not survive the opening. The travel regulations announced in November emerged from this unstable effort to manage change without surrendering command of it. That is why the eventual opening of the wall was at once accidental and deeply prepared. The exact sequence depended on miscommunication. The broader collapse had been assembling for months and, in a wider sense, for years. The press conference on November 9th has entered history because it condensed so much into a few confused minutes. Günter Schabowski, a senior East German official, stood before journalists to explain new travel arrangements. The intent from above was still bureaucratic, still managed. Citizens would apply, procedures would exist, the state would supervise change. But Schabowski was insufficiently briefed on the timing and details. When asked when the new rules would take effect, he answered, after a moment's uncertainty, that they were valid immediately, without delay. It was one of the most consequential ambiguities in modern history. The statement raced across television and radio. In homes throughout East Berlin and beyond, people heard what sounded like a revolution in administrative language. If travel was permitted immediately, then the crossing points, by implication, should open. Yet the officials at those points had received no coherent instructions matching public expectation. This gap between announcement and implementation was everything. Had the leadership synchronized communication with enforcement, the process might have been slower, more controlled, perhaps still historic, but less explosive. Instead, the state told the public one thing and told its own border personnel very little that could withstand the pressure of public interpretation. The result was not immediate collapse at every checkpoint, but rising uncertainty. People went out to see if the announcement was real. Some carried documents. Some came only to ask questions. Others came because the possibility was too large to ignore. Crowds formed. Border guards telephoned superiors. Superiors hesitated or passed responsibility upward. No one wanted to authorize an irreversible opening, but neither did many want to be the person who fired into a crowd over a policy that television had apparently just changed. Here we see the peculiar anatomy of authoritarian breakdown. It is not always dramatic in the first instant. Often it appears as a sequence of delayed decisions inside a hierarchy suddenly terrified of its own visibility. Everyone understands that whatever they do may become history. That awareness can paralyze command. At Bornholmer Strasse, one of the major crossing points, pressure mounted particularly sharply. The officer in charge, Harold Jaeger, found himself handling an impossible situation. More and more people arrived. The orders remained unclear. The risk of panic or violence increased. Eventually, the barriers were opened. Once one crossing effectively gave way, the logic of the wall's permanence was shattered. Other checkpoints followed. The border regime did not receive a formal funeral. It became untenable by losing coherence point by point, face by face, barrier by barrier. That is why the event still feels so startling in retrospect. Something that had looked monolithic fell victim not to superior force, but to the inability of a system to act consistently at the moment when consistency mattered most. What the cameras captured that night was ecstasy, but ecstasy is only one register of historical transformation. Alongside joy was disorientation, because people were entering spaces they had not inhabited for years or had never inhabited at all. The first crossings were full of practical awkwardness. Documents were stamped or not stamped. Some travelers moved cautiously, unsure whether they were witnessing a temporary irregularity or a genuine opening. West Berliners greeted arrivals with flowers, drinks, tears, applause, and the stunned hospitality reserved for moments one had hoped for too long to believe they were finally happening. Cars rolled through checkpoints amid cheers. S-Bahn and U-Bahn routes that had symbolized division began to recover meaning as routes rather than scars. Yet, even in these jubilant hours, no one had solved the administrative, economic, or constitutional consequences of what was happening. What existed was a public fact before it was a governmental one. That distinction shaped everything that followed. Crowds climbed onto the wall, turning the object itself into a stage. This mattered not merely because it made dramatic images, but because it reversed the hierarchy of the border. For decades, guards had stood above, observing and controlling. Now ordinary citizens stood above, using elevation not to dominate, but to celebrate and witness. The wall had lost its claim to vertical authority. Soon hammers, chisels, and whatever tools could be found began striking the concrete. At first, these blows were symbolic, tiny against a vast structure. But symbols are part of how political reality hardens. Each chipped fragment made visible what had become psychologically true. The barrier was now vulnerable. Mauerspect, the wall peckers, as they came to be called, turned destruction into participation. One did not need a legislative program to understand that a piece of the wall in one's hand meant history had changed materially. At the same time, officials scrambled to manage what had become a transnational event. The Federal Republic under Helmut Kohl now faced an opportunity few had expected to arrive so quickly. East German authorities confronted the unraveling of their own regime in public. Foreign governments recalculated. The Soviet Union watched a process it no longer fully controlled. The opening of the wall did not instantly produce German unity, but it made non-unity feel increasingly untenable. Once the border's moral and political legitimacy had evaporated, the structures built upon it entered a more precarious phase. The city was ahead of the state. The public was ahead of the bureaucracy. Reality was ahead of doctrine. That is one reason the night retains such emotional charge. It was not managed change. It was a people outrunning the script written for them, and doing so in front of the entire world. The weeks after the wall opened were full of euphoria, but they were also full of acceleration. Political possibilities that had once seemed remote now arrived one after another. The East German regime, already weak, could not recover authority after losing its defining mechanism of control. New parties emerged. Old loyalties dissolved. Public debate widened dramatically. Citizens who had spent years speaking cautiously now found themselves in a cacophonous political field where everything, from reform socialism to rapid unification, could be argued in public. West Germany moved quickly, both because enthusiasm for unity was immense and because leaders feared that delay might produce instability, economic collapse in the East, or international complications. Helmut Kohl's 10-point plan signaled that unity was no longer a sentimental abstraction but a governmental project. Yet that project required navigating anxieties beyond Germany. Britain and France worried about the implications of a larger Germany in the center of Europe. Poland worried about borders. The Soviet Union worried about security and the fate of alliances. The United States supported unity but also had to manage the endgame of a continental order that had structured its post-war strategy. Thus, the fall of the wall, while intensely local in imagery, immediately reopened the great question of Europe. What kind of order would replace bipolar division? What would happen to NATO, the Warsaw Pact, Soviet influence, European integration? Could German unity be achieved without alarming neighbors whose 20th century memory included disasters associated with German power? These questions remind us that the wall was never only a German object. It was part of the architecture of post-war Europe. Removing one wall required rethinking entire rooms of the geopolitical house. For East Germans, meanwhile, freedom arrived intertwined with uncertainty about work, pensions, property, currency, law, and identity. It is one thing to tear down a barrier. It is another to merge lives shaped by different institutions for 40 years. Still, momentum favored rapid change. The March 1990 elections in East Germany showed the strength of pro-unification forces. Currency union followed. Negotiations produced the 2+4 agreement, which settled external aspects of German unity. On October 3, 1990, the German Democratic Republic ceased to exist and the Federal Republic was enlarged to include its territory. This legal unification is often narrated as the natural conclusion to the wall's opening. But natural is the wrong word. It was contingent, negotiated, and immensely costly, emotionally and economically. Unity was desired by many, but it was not simple. The wall's opening had made one future possible. Building that future required choices that would leave deep marks on both halves of the country for decades. One of the myths that grew quickly around 1989 is that the wall's fall resolved the problem of division as soon as it ended the border regime. In truth, reunification exposed new forms of difference even as it healed older ones. Economically, the gap between East and West was severe. East German industry, sheltered and politically maintained under socialist conditions, proved far less competitive in the capitalist marketplace than many had hoped. Factories closed. Entire regions experienced unemployment on a scale unfamiliar under the old system, where official ideology had promised full employment even when productivity lagged. The Treuhand Agency, charged with privatizing East German state assets, became one of the most controversial institutions of reunification. To many in the East, it symbolized not renewal but liquidation. Workplaces that had defined local identities disappeared. Skilled workers found themselves devalued. Managers from the West arrived with expertise, capital, and authority, while many Easterners experienced the new order as something done to them rather than made with them. None of this means reunification was a mistake. It means that liberation from a border regime does not automatically settle the social consequences of merging systems shaped by different histories. Memory also diverged. For many in the West, 1989 confirmed a story of democratic patience, Western resilience, and the inevitable superiority of liberal capitalism. For many in the East, the story was more complicated. Exhilaration mixed with loss, vindication mixed with humiliation, freedom mixed with dislocation. Some remembered the GDR primarily as oppression and stagnation. Others remembered not the regime's legitimacy, but aspects of everyday life. Childcare, community, work routines, social guarantees that vanished in the rush of transformation. This phenomenon, later described through the language of nostalgia, was sometimes mocked in the West as sentimental distortion. But nostalgia in post-authoritarian societies is rarely simple endorsement of dictatorship. More often it expresses grief for an entire life world that disappeared, even if parts of that world deserved to disappear. The wall's fall, therefore, did not erase historical complexity. It intensified it. Germany became one state again, but not one memory. Even the urban landscape of Berlin preserved traces of asymmetry. Streets were rebuilt, transit reconnected, memorials erected, but the old line remained ghosted in architecture, property patterns, economic difference, and the biographies of those who had lived on either side. Children after reunification inherited a city without a functioning wall, but with adults whose gestures, assumptions, and stories had all been shaped by it. History had not ended. It had changed form. The international meaning of the wall's fall was just as layered. For much of the Cold War, Berlin had functioned as a theater in which the antagonism between superpowers could be dramatized in concentrated form. The opening of the wall therefore became, almost immediately, the emblem of a wider transformation. The apparent triumph of liberal democracy, the collapse of Soviet imperial management in Eastern Europe, and the prospect of a continent whole and free. In the early 1990s, this produced a mood in parts of the West that now feels almost impossible to recover. A sense that history's central ideological conflict had been settled in favor of openness, markets, and democratic pluralism. The wall became Exhibit A in the case against authoritarian planning and closed borders. Pieces of it were displayed around the world as relics of defeated division. Yet the confidence of that moment concealed unresolved questions. If the Cold War was ending, what would replace the disciplines it had imposed? Would NATO remain and expand? How would Russia interpret the loss of empire and buffer states? What would happen in regions where communist rule had frozen national conflicts rather than solved them? The Yugoslav wars of the 1990s offered one brutal answer. The end of bipolar rigidity did not usher in a universal peace. Elsewhere, the optimism associated with 1989 would, over time, encounter backlash, inequality, migration crises, revived nationalism, and new forms of authoritarian politics. None of this invalidates the significance of the wall's fall, but it does remind us that symbols often carry more hope than history can quickly satisfy. The wall did not vanish into a world already prepared to live without walls. It vanished into a world that would continue to produce barriers, physical and mental, even after declaring old ones illegitimate. That irony has become sharper in the 21st century, an era in which border walls, surveillance systems, and politics of exclusion have hardly disappeared. The difference is that Berlin's wall left behind a standard against which such structures can be judged. It taught one unforgettable lesson. Barriers that claim permanence are still political artifacts, not geological facts. They are built, maintained, narrated, and therefore, under certain conditions, can also be dismantled. The fact that new walls emerge elsewhere does not weaken Berlin's meaning. It broadens it. The wall's history is no longer only German history. It is part of the global vocabulary through which people think about division, state fear, mobility, and the limits of control. To remember the Berlin Wall only as a triumphal ending is therefore to miss what it reveals about political systems more broadly. The wall was not built because one state was uniquely cruel in the abstract. It was built because a regime confronted a legitimacy crisis it could not solve by persuasion. Faced with the hemorrhage of citizens and the humiliating comparison embodied by West Berlin, East German leaders chose immobilization. They did what insecure systems often do. They converted weakness into architecture. That move was rational on its own terms. It stopped the outflow, stabilized the state, and bought decades of survival. But the cost of that survival accumulated in moral contradiction. The more the regime claimed to embody the people, the more glaring it became that it had to trap the people to keep them. The wall was thus a structure in which practical success and ideological failure coexisted. It worked. That was precisely the problem. It worked by exposing what the state could not admit about itself. Its later collapse followed the same logic in reverse. The opening of the wall was not simply the victory of truth over lies or freedom over tyranny, however tempting such formulas may be. It was the moment when a system that had long relied on discipline, fear, and managed normality encountered a changing environment it could no longer process. The state tried to reform without losing control, but reform introduced ambiguity. Ambiguity invited public testing. Public testing revealed inconsistency. Inconsistency dissolved fear. Once fear no longer guaranteed obedience, control could survive only through mass violence. And by 1989, the conditions for such violence had changed. The wall's opening therefore illuminates how regimes fail. not always through military defeat, but through the erosion of administrative certainty and the public recognition that the script is no longer binding. In Berlin, that recognition spread by word of mouth, television, crowds, and the sheer empirical force of watching other people do what had been forbidden. It was an event made of perception. You could see the old world wobble. You could see officials hesitate. You could see the concrete remain in place while its authority drained away. That visibility is what made the night so powerful. People were not merely told that history had changed. They watched change expose itself moment by moment. And once they had seen it, they could not go back to inhabiting the wall as mere weather. It had become what it always was underneath the routines, a human arrangement, and therefore a mortal one. Today, Berlin carries the memory of the wall in fragments, memorials, preserved sections, street markings, museums, empty lots, altered neighborhoods, and the stories of those who still orient themselves by a line that no longer blocks passage. Tourists can walk stretches of the former Death Strip and then wander into districts where the old border is almost invisible unless someone points it out. This partial invisibility is one of the city's profound historical facts. The wall has vanished enough to make its former dominance difficult for later generations to imagine fully, yet not so completely that memory can dissolve. In some places, brass lines in the pavement trace where the barrier stood. In others, preserved watchtowers or sections of wall insist on material recollection. Memorial culture in Berlin has had to answer a difficult question. How does one commemorate a structure whose power depended on normalization? If one monumentalizes it too grandly, one risks aestheticizing oppression. If one lets it disappear too fully, one risks losing the feel of what division meant. The city's answer has been plural and imperfect, as memory always is. Former border sites host exhibitions on escape attempts, deaths, and the machinery of surveillance. Museums reconstruct checkpoints, living spaces, and political contexts. Art covers surviving segments. The East Side Gallery transforms a remnant of separation into a canvas of commentary and reinvention. School children learn dates, but families carry older knowledge and anecdote. Where a crossing once stood, where a relative waited, where gunfire was heard, where permits were denied, where a first visit after 1989 took place. The wall thus survives not only as history, but as afterlife. It remains an orienting absence. For scholars, it is a case study in authoritarian control, border studies, memory politics, and Cold War systems. For Berliners who lived with it, it can still be intimate in ways academic language cannot fully hold. For younger generations, it is both lesson and warning. Proof that the ordinary can contain the unthinkable long enough to feel normal, and proof that what feels normal can end quickly once enough pressures converge. Perhaps that is why the wall still matters so much. It reminds us that the built environment can naturalize political violence without making that violence natural. It reminds us that division can become routine without becoming just. And it reminds us that the collapse of an unjust system, though exhilarating, does not erase the decades through which people learned to live inside it. Berlin is one city now, but it is also a city that knows what it means to be taught separation and then to outlive it. The men who guarded the wall lived inside its contradictions as well, though not in the same way as those they were ordered to stop. Border troops were not abstract instruments. They were young men, often conscripts, placed inside a system that trained them to believe they were defending peace, socialism, and anti-fascist order against hostile penetration from the West. They learned rules, routes, distances, reporting procedures, challenge protocols, and the use of weapons within a carefully constructed moral frame. The death strip was not presented to them as a scene of trapped citizens. It was described as a vulnerable frontier, a zone where enemies, provocateurs, saboteurs, and traitors might exploit weakness. This ideological reframing mattered because no state can rely on coercion alone without also trying to shape the conscience of those who enforce it. Yet the wall exposed those enforcers to realities doctrine could not completely absorb. They saw desperation. They heard pleas. They watched families at the edge of impossible decisions. They knew, even when they did not articulate it, that the people running were not foreign invaders but fellow Germans trying to leave. Some guards internalized the mission. Some brutalized it. Some broke under its moral strain. There were defections from the border troops themselves, an especially humiliating reminder that even the men tasked with sealing the line could reject the world it represented. Others remained loyal and later struggled to explain, to courts and to themselves, what loyalty had meant in a system that normalized deadly force against civilians. After the wall fell, the question of responsibility did not vanish. Former guards and political leaders faced legal and moral scrutiny. Defenders argued that they had acted under law, under orders, within a sovereign state. Critics replied that legality inside such a state could not cleanse the deliberate use of lethal force to maintain a prison-like border. These debates were not merely retrospective. They revealed how deeply the wall had entered ordinary structures of obedience. The regime had not been maintained only by fanatics or elites. It had been maintained by office clerks, railway officials, construction planners, teachers, local party functionaries, informants, and armed young men in towers. That diffusion of responsibility is one reason the wall remains such a revealing case. It shows how systems of division embed themselves in everyday roles until the exceptional begins to feel procedural. And it shows how, when the system collapses, individuals are left asking not only what they did, but how the range of imaginable action became so narrow for so long. The border troops' story complicates easy moral comfort. It does not excuse. It clarifies. The wall was not simply imposed by a handful of villains. It was administered by institutions populated with human beings who learned to convert orders into routine. Its opening, therefore, was also a release, in however uneven a sense, from the machinery that had trained people to live professionally inside division. No history of the wall is complete without the Stasi, because the wall was never just a line at the edge of a city. It was the visible edge of a much larger system of information control. The Ministry for State Security understood that movement and speech were linked. A population that could be watched internally was easier to immobilize externally. Informants were cultivated not only to detect grand conspiracies, but to map ordinary loyalties, private frustrations, and networks of trust. This saturation did not mean the Stasi knew everything. It meant that people often had to assume they might be observed. An assumption is a powerful political instrument. It shapes self-censorship long before any officer opens a file. The wall and the Stasi reinforced each other. One restricted physical movement. The other sought to manage the social and psychological conditions that might generate disobedience. Together, they produced a society in which the boundary existed both at the city's edge and within private relationships. Friends wondered which topics were safe. Artists encoded critique through indirection. Workers complained in guarded tones. Parents taught children caution, not because children were untrustworthy, but because innocence itself could become a danger in a world where the wrong remark in the wrong room had consequences. This is important because when the wall fell, what opened was not only a checkpoint. Archives opened too, eventually, and with them a different kind of shock. East Germans discovered the extent to which lives had been documented, interpreted, and betrayed. Relationships once remembered as merely strained or broken were reframed by knowledge of surveillance. Public memory of the GDR after 1989 was shaped not only by economic transition and border history, but by the revelation that secrecy had been bureaucratized into intimacy. The files made clear that the state had treated its citizens not as a people to be trusted, but as a population to be read for signs of deviation. The fall of the wall, therefore, became inseparable from the exposure of the social damage done behind it. If the border had represented immobilized conflict, the Stasi files represented internalized suspicion. Both were forms of division. Both survived the physical opening of November in different ways. The archives could not be undone. The knowledge they contained entered reunified Germany as a moral and political problem. How to prosecute, how to forgive, how to remember, how to live with the fact that authoritarian systems do not simply wound through prisons and bullets, but through the corrosion of everyday trust. When Berliners climbed onto the wall on that November night, they could not yet see the full shape of what would later emerge from filing cabinets and shredded paper. But the same system that had built the concrete had also built the secret text of millions of lives. Its collapse would eventually make both visible. The churches that became spaces of opposition in the late GDR deserve special attention because they reveal one of the paradoxes of authoritarian decline. A state can control enormous resources and still leave small pockets of moral autonomy within which alternative language survives. In East Germany, Protestant churches never formed a unified revolutionary front, nor were they simply outside the system. Their position was more complex, tolerated, constrained, occasionally infiltrated, but not fully absorbable into the regime's ideological machinery. That partial autonomy mattered. It allowed conversations about peace, ecology, human rights, and civic responsibility to gather in spaces that were not entirely private and not fully under party control. The Monday prayers in Leipzig, which became so closely linked to the demonstrations of 1989, were not inevitable engines of collapse. They were fragile gatherings within a monitored society. Yet fragility can be powerful because it creates room for conscience before it creates room for mass politics. When demonstrations grew out of these church-centered milieus, they did so with a moral tone different from simple riot. Candles, prayers, petitions, and disciplined marching created a public language that forced the regime into a dilemma. To crush such gatherings violently was possible, but the optics, both domestic and international, were costly. The regime had spent decades describing itself as a peace state, a workers' state, an anti-fascist state. Beating or shooting large numbers of disciplined demonstrators who were publicly claiming moral seriousness risked exposing the emptiness of that language too clearly. This does not mean church opposition toppled the wall by itself. It means that when broader crisis came, there already existed networks, habits, and spaces in which dissent could become visible without immediately dissolving into chaos. The moral choreography of the autumn protests mattered. So did the slogan, "We are the people," which did not merely express anger but challenged the regime's monopoly on representation. In a socialist state that claimed to rule in the name of the people, such a slogan was devastating. It forced a question the system could not answer without admitting its own contradiction. If the people were now in the street against the state, what exactly was the state still claiming to embody? The wall's opening later that November cannot be reduced to this question, but it cannot be separated from it either. The checkpoints opened in a world already altered by weeks of public courage that had made fear less reliable. The church spaces had helped prepare that world. They did not dictate the miscommunication at the press conference or the decisions at Bornholmer Strasse, but they changed the atmosphere in which officials calculated risk and citizens measured their own willingness to act. Opposition had acquired a public rhythm. The wall would fall into that rhythm, not into silence. Global media transformed the fall of the wall from a German event into a world historical image almost instantly. Television mattered here in a way earlier crises had only partially anticipated. By 1989, the images of Berlin could circulate in near real time across continents. Viewers in London, Paris, New York, Moscow, Warsaw, Buenos Aires, and beyond did not have to wait for the slow consolidation of historical narrative. They could watch confusion become opening, opening become crowd movement, and crowd movement become symbol before officials had agreed on what to call any of it. This speed of witnessing changed the event itself. Politicians responded within a media environment already saturated with triumphant imagery. East German authorities could not plausibly reassert a total narrative monopoly while the world watched citizens climbing the wall and passing through checkpoints. Western governments, too, were drawn into a visual logic that encouraged celebration even when strategic caution remained necessary. The camera turned the wall into an instant relic before it was physically dismantled. Hammers against concrete became not only acts of local participation, but a universal grammar of liberation. This visual triumph has shaped memory ever since, but it also risks simplifying the night into a morality play. Television prefers moments of release over years of attrition. It captures tears more easily than bureaucratic decay. It loves the top of the wall more than the files, transit agreements, church meetings, embassy occupations, and whispered calculations that made the night possible. Yet without those slower, uglier, more administrative histories, the beautiful images would not exist. The fall of the wall was one of the first great geopolitical transitions of the television age in which the imagery of freedom traveled fast enough to help define the meaning of the event before historians, governments, or institutions could stabilize it. This bestowed enormous symbolic power on Berlin. It also froze certain frames in public memory. Even today, when people say the Berlin Wall fell, they often picture jubilant youth, bright lights, and a clean rupture. Far fewer picture the exhausted border officer making a decision under impossible pressure, the provincial party member watching the news in dread, the factory worker in Leipzig who had spent weeks marching with no assurance that he would not be beaten, or the East German mother who crossed with joy and then faced years of difficult adaptation in a reunified country that did not always know how to receive her experience. Media made the walls fall unforgettable. It also made it dangerously easy to compress. To tell the story, well, we must restore the thickness that the camera could only sample in flashes. The negotiations that produced formal German unification remind us that history does not end when crowds celebrate. The opening of the wall created momentum, but momentum had to be translated into treaties, currencies, legal systems, alliance structures, property settlements, and international guarantees. The 2+4 talks, bringing together the two German states and the four wartime occupying powers, were not technical afterthoughts. They were the diplomatic bridge between emotional revolution and sovereign transformation. Questions that ordinary citizens crossing checkpoints might never have considered had now become urgent. Would a unified Germany belong to NATO? What would happen to Soviet troops stationed in East Germany? How could neighboring states be reassured that German unity would not become a return of historical menace? What border would a united Germany formally accept with Poland? What kind of constitutional path would bind eastern lands into the Federal Republic? These were not abstract matters. They determined whether unity would be peaceful, recognized, and durable. The speed with which they had to be settled reflected the unstable moment. Delay could generate uncertainty or backlash. Haste could generate resentment or error. Helmut Kohl's government moved with notable urgency, partly out of conviction, partly out of fear that the window might narrow. Mikhail Gorbachev, wrestling with crises inside the Soviet Union, eventually accepted terms that would have been almost unimaginable a few years earlier. Soviet acquiescence was not surrender in a simple sense. It was the result of changed realities, economic weakness, diplomatic exchange, and the recognition that brute reversal would be ruinous. The resulting agreements gave German unity international legitimacy, but legitimacy does not erase the asymmetry with which unity occurred. The Federal Republic did not merge with an equal Eastern counterpart to create a brand new state. In effect, the East joined the institutions, currency, legal order, and constitutional framework of the West. This was practical and, in many ways, unavoidable. It was also psychologically loaded. Many Easterners later felt that unity had meant absorption more than mutual creation. Their state had vanished, the other one had expanded. Such feelings did not negate the reality that many East Germans wanted rapid unification. They did, however, shape the moral memory of the process. The wall had opened in the language of freedom. Reunification would be lived in the language of contracts, markets, closures, elections, and administrative overhaul. Both belong to the same story. To remember only the first is to romanticize. To remember only the second is to flatten the wonder of the night. History requires holding them together. Economics formed one of the least cinematic but most decisive dimensions of the wall's history. West Berlin existed under a peculiar political subsidy structure because its symbolic value exceeded its normal market logic. The Federal Republic and Western allies invested heavily to keep the enclave viable and attractive. Tax benefits, industrial support, universities, cultural institutions, and public spending all helped sustain a city that, left entirely to geography and ordinary market calculation, would have looked far less secure. This support was not charity. It was strategy dressed as civic normality. A prosperous, lively West Berlin rebutted East German claims and demonstrated that the Western Alliance would not abandon its outpost. The result was an urban culture that could be unusually creative and unusually dependent at the same time. East Germany observed this with bitterness, because West Berlin's prosperity was not only local, it was comparative. It undermined socialist claims within sight of socialist citizens. East Berlin, by contrast, operated inside a planned economy whose priorities were political as much as productive. Housing blocks rose, transport was managed, industry was maintained, and official employment remained high. Yet chronic shortages, technological lag, poor incentives, and the inability to price truthfully or adapt flexibly limited performance. Everyday life in the GDR was not one long queue without dignity, as caricature sometimes suggests, but neither was it economically confident. Consumers learned the art of waiting, saving, substituting, and calling in favors. Products might be available, eventually. Apartments existed, but often with maintenance problems and long waiting times. Leisure and consumption were filtered through scarcity as much as ideology. The wall sharpened these contrasts because it turned economic systems into neighbors. What economists describe in tables, Berliners could often feel in shops, repairs, product quality, and travel possibilities. The significance of this proximity grew in the 1980s as debt, global competition, and technological change exposed the limits of Eastern Bloc economies more starkly. East Germany still looked, by socialist standards, relatively advanced. But relative advancement inside a failing model remains failure in the long run. Once the wall opened, these economic asymmetries rushed from the background into the center. East Germans crossing westward encountered not simply emotional reunion, but a materially different consumption landscape. The Deutsche Mark came to stand for more than currency. It symbolized reliability, choice, and access, even when the social world attached to it would later prove harsher than many expected. The rapid currency union of 1990 satisfied a profound psychological desire for immediate equivalence, but it also accelerated structural shocks. Wages denominated in stronger money and industries exposed to hard competition created dynamics that many Eastern firms could not survive. The wall's opening therefore led straight into the painful revelation that political freedom and economic equalization do not move at the same speed. If the border had hidden comparative weakness behind coercion, its disappearance exposed that weakness all at once. This exposure was liberating and destabilizing in equal measure. It is impossible to understand post-wall disillusionment in parts of Eastern Germany without recognizing how deeply economic transition shaped the emotional afterlife of 1989. The wall had divided systems. The end of the wall forced those systems into contact on terms that did not treat their starting positions as equal. In the end, what gives the Berlin Wall its enduring force is that it allows us to watch history become visible, then ordinary, then visible again. When it was built, the extraordinary became routine with terrifying speed. Streets that had once connected became dead ends. Watchtowers became part of the skyline. Permits and controls entered the habits of family life. Children learned not to ask certain questions too loudly. What should have remained shocking became normal enough to endure for a generation. That is one half of the lesson. The other half arrived in 1989, when normality broke and people rediscovered that what had seemed permanent was maintained by choices, institutions, and fears that could fail. This double movement, from shock to routine, and from routine back to shock, is why the wall remains such a powerful object for historical thought. It teaches that unfreedom often survives not by constant spectacle, but by settling into procedure, and that freedom often returns not in purity, but in confusion, opportunity, and acts of public improvisation. The wall opened because a vast architecture of certainty had become incapable of matching the world around it. But it also opened because enough people, over enough years, had refused to surrender the idea that another reality was possible. Some protested openly. Some fled. Some prayed. Some documented. Some argued in kitchens. Some simply held on to the memory of a city that had not always been cut in two. History does not move only through leaders and treaties. It also moves through the stubborn survival of unadministered imagination. Berlin in 1989 was full of that imagination suddenly finding form. The crowds at the checkpoints were not reading from a script. They were discovering, with each passing minute, that the range of the possible had widened. That discovery changed behavior faster than institutions could contain. And behavior, once transformed at scale, remade politics. The wall's afterlife, therefore, belongs not only to Germany or to the Cold War, but to anyone trying to understand how rigid orders unravel. It shows that systems can remain oppressive and absurd for an astonishing length of time without becoming invulnerable. It shows that people can adapt deeply to structures they hate and still, when a crack appears, move with breathtaking speed. It shows that borders are not just lines on maps, but technologies of feeling, memory, and expectation. Most of all, it shows that the end of a wall is never only the end of concrete. It is the end of the story that concrete had been telling about what was possible. On the night Berlin's wall opened, that story finally lost its force. A city walked through the gap before anyone could close it again. Europe looked on and understood that the 20th century had shifted, and history, which had lived for decades in the shadow of a barrier, began once more to move in the open. Even now, long after the checkpoints have become museum sites and the watchtowers have been reduced to memorial silhouettes, the wall continues to intervene in political language. It is invoked whenever states argue that fear justifies enclosure, whenever governments claim that the management of populations requires the management of movement, whenever leaders insist that order can only be preserved by making some exits impossible and some encounters unthinkable. The comparison is not always exact, and history is diminished when every barrier becomes every other barrier. Yet the durability of the analogy tells us something important. The Berlin Wall condensed into visible form one of the oldest political temptations to answer legitimacy problems with architecture. When rulers cannot persuade enough people to stay, they may choose to make leaving harder. When systems cannot win affection, they may choose to fortify obedience. The wall stood as one of the clearest modern examples of that temptation, and its fall stands as one of the clearest reminders that coercive permanence is still a wager, not a law of nature. That reminder is why Berlin's story continues to matter. It is not only the story of a city reunited or a Cold War symbol shattered. It is the story of how power tried to freeze history in place, and of how history, patient and cumulative, eventually moved through the cracks. That is why the wall still stands, even in absence, as one of the 20th century's most important warnings and one of its most unforgettable liberations. Its history is finished as a regime, but not as a lesson. It remains urgent. What finally made the opening of the wall feel so total was not simply that people crossed, but that so many older certainties died at once. The East German state had depended on more than police and wire. It had depended on time. It had depended on the expectation that people would age inside its structures, retire inside them, die inside them, and leave behind children who might resent the limits of their lives but would nonetheless inherit them as normal. That is how systems of division survive. They outlast outrage. They wait for memory to thin. They rely on the fact that the extraordinary, once repeated enough, turns into habit. For nearly 30 years, the GDR had wagered that the wall would complete this work. It would not merely stop departures. It would train acceptance. It would make adaptation feel wiser than longing. It would slowly convert a historical shock into the architecture of ordinary life. There was some truth in that wager. People did adapt. They married, raised children, pursued education, took holidays, found private pleasures, made careers, and learned the intricate choreography of saying enough without saying too much. But adaptation is not the same as legitimacy. It is only proof that human beings can survive inside almost anything if they must. Once pressure began to gather in the late 1980s, the difference between adaptation and belief became decisive. Large numbers of East Germans had learned how to live inside the system without ever fully surrendering their sense that another life was imaginable. Some expressed that imagination politically. Some expressed it by leaving when a route opened. Some barely expressed it at all, preserving it in silence. The wall could block trains and streets, but it could not fully extinguish comparison, memory, resentment, or desire. West German television still leaked in. Stories still traveled. Family ties still outlived checkpoints. Jokes still condensed truths no newspaper would print. By the time the crisis of 1989 ripened, the wall was therefore doing two contradictory things at once. It was preserving the regime in the short term and draining it of moral credibility in the long term. The very success of the barrier kept alive the question it could never answer honorably. If this system represents the people, why must the people be kept from leaving it? Once that question returned to public life in a season of regional upheaval, the wall's old authority no longer looked like strength. It looked like exposure. The border regime had become too revealing of the state's weakness to remain politically sustainable. There was another reason the opening felt irreversible once it began. Berliners on both sides knew the city too well to believe that the old order could simply be reassembled after such a breach. The geography of the place worked against restoration. This was not a remote frontier in mountains or desert where the state might close a gate and resume control behind distance. Berlin was dense, intimate, layered with memory, and full of people who could instantly show one another what had changed. The city itself carried too many witnesses. Every crossing became a message. Every message generated more crossings. Every successful passage made it harder for officials to persuade anyone that the opening had been a misunderstanding best corrected quietly by morning. Berlin's urban texture accelerated the collapse. So did its symbolic status. The world was watching, but Berliners themselves were watching one another with extraordinary intensity. They could measure, in the faces of neighbors and strangers, that the old script was gone. Such mutual recognition is one of the strongest forces in history. It is the moment when fear no longer isolates. Once enough people understand that others understand the same thing, the emotional economy of obedience changes. Courage stops being private. It becomes social. That is what happened at the Wall. A state that had long governed through division now faced a public gathering in which division itself was losing credibility by the minute. And yet, even after formal reunification, Berlin never became a city without ghosts. The line remained in habits of speech, in who had grown up where, in who remembered what a shopping trip or a schoolbook or a newspaper had once signified, in who distrusted Western triumphalism and who feared Eastern resentment, in the invisible sociology of property and opportunity. If history had ended in a single night, these traces would have vanished. They did not. They were folded into the life of the reunited city, where they still inform political moods and cultural memory. That afterlife is not a failure of reunification. It is evidence that large structures do not disappear without leaving mental architecture behind. Berlin learned to live beyond the wall, but living beyond something is not the same as forgetting it. The city's power now lies partly in that doubleness. It is free of the border and full of its remains. It is ordinary and permanently historical. It offers tourists the thrill of recovered openness while reminding residents that openness can be far more fragile than those tourists imagine. In that way, Berlin today still teaches the lesson the Wall taught negatively. Freedom is not a natural climate. It is a political condition sustained by institutions, habits, and public willingness to defend movement, association, and truth against systems that would prefer fixity. The Wall fell because a system of fixity failed. Its memory matters because every generation faces new versions of the temptation that built it.